Bonjour. My name is Philippe Bourbeau. I'm professor and co-director of the International Institute of Economic Diplomacy at HEC Montréal, the biggest and the strongest business school in Canada and perhaps even the world. The whole structure of our economic international order is shifting beneath our feet. From the mid-1980s until fairly recently, the whole system was organized around neoliberalism, free trade, and multilateralism. Techno-nationalism and protectionist measures were not particularly liked ideas. However, geopolitical risk, economic turbulences, supply chain disruption is forcing us to rethink how the world is organized. What is the main driver of the system? Is it still free trade? Do multinational institutions remain influential? Are regional trade agreements no longer the cornerstone of the system? I believe that resilience has become the main paradigm and the main organizing principle of the system. We have entered a resilient international economic order. Now, resilience comes in two types, in two styles. The first one is maintaining the status quo. When there's a shock, a disturbance, you try to remain who you are. You go back to a state of affair that existed prior to the shock. You bounce back. Resilience is also the capacity to see the shock as an opportunity for renewal, for transformation. The whole point is not to go back to something, but it's to move forward, to transform yourself on the basis of the shock. And the shock could be many things. It could be a financial shock. It could be a geopolitical conflict. It could be a conflict within your board of director meeting. But you have two choices. You bounce back or you bounce forward. We are indeed witnessing profound change in the system. And I think we should pay attention to how the story is unfolding. And we at the International Institute of Economic Diplomacy, in association with the Conference of Paris, Montreal, and the Forum, we do try to pay attention to how the story is unfolding. Without further ado, I would like to thank you and thank the organizer. And now I turn to the main session and discussion, which I'm sure will be fascinating. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for what will undoubtedly be a fascinating conversation around resilience and supply chains and how we can make them more solid to face all the shocks the world is facing currently. And what we're going to do is to carry on talking about resilience, of course, and deep dive into the heart of global trade networks and how to future-proof them. Our guest is Vincent Clerc, CEO at Maersk, not just one of the largest container shipping companies in the world, but a fully integrated logistics company offering supply chain solutions. So please join me in welcoming our guest very warmly this afternoon, Vincent Clerc. So why are we having this conversation around global value chains and supply chains? Well, they have been in the spotlight, of course, since the COVID-19 pandemic, which highlighted their vulnerabilities, of course, and the risk to their disruption, the risk it represents to the economy, but also to geopolitical stability. You could also argue it's also a social risk, of course. Now, in light of the recent US elections and an increasingly tense rhetoric on tariffs, escalating global conflicts, shifting sustainability priorities, and the rise of game-changing technologies like AI, what must we consider to build robust and sustainable supply chains? And that is the $30 billion dollar question I'm putting through to you, Vincent Clerc, which will become a $45 billion dollar question by 2027, according to forecasts. So, while some argue that we may have entered a period of deglobalization, the statistics I have just shared show that it may not be the case. After all, clearly trade across the world is still flourishing. So could you start this conversation by presenting the state of play from your perspective on global trade, the prospects and the key challenges you are currently facing?
Yeah, thank you. Let me try to do that. I think what is really important to consider when we think about the state of play for the global supply chain today is that this is one of the largest global piece of infrastructure, and it's been built on the back of the fall of the Berlin Wall at early 90s, the opening of China and Deng Xiaoping's liberalization policies, and we've gone through a period of about 30 years of globally integrating China and the world around a very long global supply chain. It took 30 years to get that done. And it has created a huge amount of wealth. Hundreds of millions of people come out of poverty as a result. It's based on the differentiated advantage theory or comparative advantage theory, and it has created actually a very layered and very global infrastructure that all our way of life today completely relies on. And then in the last 7 to 8 years, 5 to 7 years, there's clearly been some shift as some also of the more complicated effect of that supply chain came to the fore. One of it is the vulnerability of having one global fully integrated, very long supply chain. COVID demonstrated that. Second is some of the imbalances that there is in having a global supply chains, trade imbalances, wealth creation gap, inequalities. That has also come to the fore through a lot of different elections. And we're seeing now basically that global model being set in question. Now, what you read is that there is deglobalization happening. The reality on the ground, if you look at the numbers, is that it's not that simple. It took 30 years to build this global supply chain. It will take decades to unwind it and change it. And actually, the dream of being able to live local for local and produce everything that we consume in Europe, I don't think is actually something that anybody is proposing. Everybody knows that we're going to need to rely to a great extent to a continued global supply chain, but we need to make it more resilient. We need to be less vulnerable to single points of sourcing. We need to make it less vulnerable to weaponization of parts of the supply chain. We need to think a little bit different about alternative ways of sourcing and how we're going to also deal with some of the challenges that we have today, like climate change. So the way we're thinking about this is not really a deglobalization. I don't think it's very realistic and certainly not backed up by any type of data or program. But what you're seeing is actually that we have started to deal with some of the impact that having one global infrastructure is having in the world that we're living in today, where it's no longer just a one way towards neoliberalism, but there are other trends and currents that are affecting it.
So before we move on to the solutions you offer to address the challenges you've mentioned, I just want to talk about trade tensions, since they are on the rise. I've mentioned it in my introduction, of course, with the rhetoric on tariffs coming from the US, particularly intense currently. What's your assessment of the situation? And by the way, trade wars are not exactly a new concept, are they?
No, I think what is important to understand fundamentally is what is negotiation and what is policy. And from a policy perspective, clearly there is fairly broad consensus in the United States that this global supply chain today has created some distortions that have left the United States very vulnerable on certain raw material, very vulnerable on certain capabilities and know-how. I can take an example just within my field. 90% of ships that are being built today are built in China. Not a big deal to have a global commercial fleet for the US, but it's a big deal from knowledge about how to build ships when you also have to build military, navy, and stuff like that. And so it means that suddenly a lot of know-how and technology is being developed on shipbuilding in China and is being lost in America. That can be a significant strategic disadvantage. And so for certain sectors, it's true for microchips, it's true for shipbuilding, it's true for certain technologies like AI and so on. There is an interest in making sure that some of the distortions and vulnerabilities are being corrected. That, I think, is probably a fair attempt. There is similar attempts being made in Europe to make sure to deal with also some of the vulnerabilities that have evolved. After that, whether tariff is a good tool or a bad tool, to what extent it's going to be used, we'll have to see. I don't think anybody really knows how much is negotiation, how much will be implemented. It's fair to assume that some will be, but probably not to the extent that is being feared today.
Well, since you mentioned AI, and everyone's mentioning AI these days, and Gen AI in particular, what role can technology play? How do you intend to leverage AI? And is it really a game changer when I remember 10 or 12 years ago, the industry, your industry in particular, having many hopes and many conversations around the role of blockchain, for instance, which was meant to be a very disruptive technology that was going to somehow alleviate many pain points in your industry, which is still very paper heavy, isn't it? So what are your personal or industry-wide hopes when it comes to AI? How do you intend to go about it, to integrate it? What's the opportunity there for you?
So I do think actually that AI is significantly different from what blockchain was a decade ago. Just the amount of use case that we can see AI being applied into our field when it comes to supply chain. I can give you the example. We operate today a fleet of about 4 million containers, so the boxes that you see on the road or in the ports. They're full and transporting cargo for about 120 days of the year. That leaves a lot of days where they are either waiting empty for the next load or being moved. We spend more than $2 billion every year moving empty containers to reposition them for the next job that they're going to have. So if you look at optimization when it comes to routing, optimization when it comes to demand sensing, the leverage also of large language models to deal with a lot of the queries that customers still have and companies still have to understand what's going on along the way. There is just a huge amount of applications that I think will automate a lot of the workflows that today still rely on a lot of manual input, and that will at the same time take out a lot of cost out of the supply chain of our customers as a result, and counter some of the inflationary pressure we will continue to see. Because if you need to have a more resilient supply chain, once you've optimized it for cost, it's likely to be inflationary to a certain extent. And then we're going to need to counterbalance some of these inflationary pressure with areas of synergies. And that's actually what one of the key challenges today is, actually the deployment of technology, of digitalization and of AI to digitize workflow, take cost out, and create new efficiency frontier for what our operation can do.
So clearly there's a lot of potential, of course, but is the industry ready? And the reason why I'm asking is because your industry, shipping and cargo, is a traditional industry. So I imagine that there's a lot of upskilling and education, upskilling the workforce, your own workforce, but also education to do with clients and all the stakeholders in global supply chains. So how do you intend to implement that?
So is the industry ready? I think the industry, I don't know, but the way I'm thinking about this is the first companies that will master the deployment of AI are likely to rule and to have significant competitive advantage, both from a safety, from a cost, and from a quality perspective towards their customers. And it's going to create, I think, an arms race on the deployment of those technologies because of the advantage that they can provide. So I think there is clearly now a rush towards implementing this. I heard in the session this morning, a lot of things is going to be probably hyped more than what it is really worth, but some of the use cases will come through and generate a significant return and will have huge implications, I think, for the future of the global supply chain.
So what's your vision for the supply chain of the future? And maybe to address that question, you could tell us a bit more about your Network of the Future initiative.
Yeah, so I think it's very much aligned with the concept of resilience. So one of the characteristics of the global supply chain today, especially as we're seeing a lot of disruptions, a lot of volatility in demand and so on, is that it is very, very subject or increasingly subject to shock. And that was very visible during COVID, for example, where we had like large traffic jams and difficulties in actually getting containers moved. There was not enough capacity in the world. So as a result, we're investing in increasing the size of the pipes, the capacity, but we're also changing the way that we deploy our network so that they become more resilient to either disruptions coming from the supply chain, from climate, from any type of wars, geopolitical events. And we're doing this by modularizing the network and moving from what has been common design for the past 40 years into being more of a hub and spoke model where we can actually insulate issues much faster, deal with them much more efficiently, and where we can create large efficiencies. So to transport the same amount of containers, we can probably reduce the number of miles that we need to sail by about 9%, which is in terms of decarbonization, it's a huge impact. So it creates a lot of efficiencies, and it creates a lot more resilience in the network and a lot more quality in terms of reliability to customers.
So let's discuss your decarbonization efforts a little bit further, because we've had many conversations here at Conférence de Paris around the transition and whether the green transition or energy transition will be somehow on the back burner given the return of conservatism from the other side of the Atlantic anyway. So does it remain a priority for your company and your industry? And what's your strategy to pursue this green transition and transformation?
So absolutely, I think this is the energy transition is one of the imperatives of our generation, and I think that we have a duty as business, especially in a company like ours that has been around for 120 years, has been active in very energy intensive businesses over these 120 years. We've been part of the problem, and as we realize the impact that this climate change is having, I think we also have a duty to be part of the solution, and to invest ourselves into preserving this infrastructure. I said before, all of our lifestyles here is reliant on this global supply chain and global trade. We can't have our way of lives without this. But we need to change the fact that this is such a cost on climate that we need to change. And we need to find solution where we can rebuild or keep that global infrastructure on which we rely so heavily and do it in a sustainable way. What we have done is we have started the decarbonization by actually changing 3 years ago. We've started to order ships that can run on green methanol. So basically liquefied, gasified, biomass-based fuel. This is a big step. Today we have 8 of these ships. We operate more than 700, so there's a long way to go. But this is why actually we have a roadmap now where all of the renewal of our fleet in the next 20 years will do that. We can replace every one of those ships by a ship that is moving on a technology that actually does not add to carbon. And that will be, it's a transformation that has changed, that has started. It's a transformation that has actually quite a lot of momentum, not only with Maersk, but with a lot of our competitors, because there is a huge need for us to consider the long term. Legislators can decide from one day to the other that they want to change what fuel we're allowed to use, but our ships have a 25 to 30 years economic life. So unless we start to place our bets well ahead of that and future-proof our strategy, then we risk at some point facing a big consequence for that. So we're moving in that direction. We'll continue to move in that direction. It is imperative at some point that this is also being backed from the regulator side with a price on carbon. The reality is that the reason why our economy is so dependent on carbon today is because it is the cheapest way we have to run our economy. And nobody likes inflation. And in order to do that in a non-inflation prone way, we're going to need to make it easier for companies and for consumers to make the right choice as those technologies ramp up, scale up, go through the learning curve, and can bring their cost of production in line with what we know today from the carbon. If you leave this simply to market forces, it will happen eventually, but I'm just afraid of the consequence from a climate perspective will be significantly more dire than what we can do with a bit of a push from the regulatory side.
Well, that's food for thought. Thank you very much for that. You've mentioned the various risks you are facing from climate change to geopolitics. Of course, climate change has a direct impact on your operations, and you've got to adapt as well to that risk, not just mitigate. So what's your advice to businesses looking to protect their supply chains? How do you mitigate all the risks that are now in today's lives? It's basically the reality for many companies that you don't know what's coming up next, black swan events, etc. We are living in a very uncertain and volatile world.
So, we have the advantage that for the most part, our ships are floating. So rising oceans would just mean that we're floating a few meters higher. So climate change is not a huge risk to the run of the operation or the run of the supply chain. As much as it is a risk to society in general, change of water, precipitation patterns, droughts, and so on, which have very, very disruptive views. I think the only insurance that there is against the effect of climate change is to actually lean into energy transition. That's the only remedy I can see. The rest, we're going to have to deal, continuing to future-proofing our supply chains. It still means, for instance, that having dual sourcing for a lot of your raw materials or key components is important in case one part is affected by tornadoes or weather-related event or political events or unrest or what have you. So just optimizing everything for cost and being hyper-reliant on one area, one city, one vendor can be very difficult. So continuing that movement towards diversification, I think, is the only wise thing to do. But that doesn't insulate you from the impact of climate change. It helps you weather it better.
And as a business leader, how do you keep on sticking to a vision, since you have to adapt to challenges all the time? What's your advice to all the business leaders here who are wondering how to handle all this lack of visibility and the possibility of change overnight?
Yeah, I think, so for me, there's a couple of things. First of all, every time you get onto your news feed in the morning, it's tough not to feel that there is just a tremendous amount of noise right now. And I think for me, what is really, really important is to separate what is noise and what is signal. In other cases, what is something that may be good or bad, but I have no influence on, and it doesn't really, there's nothing I can do about it, to what is something that I should relate to, because actually we can make decisions or we can do something that will actually impact positively what is going to happen. And being able to tune off the noise, focus on the signal, and being clear on where the dot on the wall is, where we're trying to get to. So that, we took the example of energy transition. We need to be clear on where we need to be by when, and what are some of the things that we need, the milestones that we need to meet on the way. After that, things will move a bit to the right or a bit to the left. We just need to be able to stay the course. It doesn't mean everything is a straight line. You need to take some adjustments on the way, but you need to stay there. It's the same also for the deployment of technologies. It's the same for the deployment of networks, investments that we make. We make a lot of capital investments. We're making bets for decades to come on certain technologies, on the viability of certain trades or infrastructure. So you have to be really keen on what is noise and what is signal, and try to really focus on what you think the long term is going to be about. In a way, a lot of what happens today I believe, is either accelerating or slowing down something that will happen anyway. We're going to need to decarbonize. Hopefully we do it on time so that we can stay within a degree and a half or 2 degrees. But if we don't do it, I mean, we will decarbonize anyway. So you know, there may be some twists on the road, but you need to stay really clear on what the signals are and keep on leading your organization towards meeting the challenge.
We don't have much time left. It's time to wrap up, unfortunately. I'd like you maybe to conclude, to recap what we've mentioned during our conversation to build a robust and sustainable supply chain. That strong vision we've just talked about. Adaptability, flexibility. What else?
I think the most important part, aside from this, is most companies today actually do not control their supply chain. They rely on a lot of vendors to do that. It's an outsourced infrastructure. Having very strong strategic partnerships with the companies that take care of your supply chain is, where I'm coming from, a really, really good idea. Because there is a lot of stuff that have happened during COVID that were absolutely avoidable if customers and vendors were actually closer in how they manage this. Many companies would not dream of not having that type of relationship with their technology service providers, because they realize how important a piece of infrastructure it is for them. And it is outsourced also to a great extent. And for me, the supply chain is similar. There is a real important, it's an industry in it by itself. It has capabilities, knowledge on which all businesses absolutely rely on. And it is too much of a black box sometimes. And the importance of facing this challenge through a coalition of the willing and being able to freely exchange ideas and make those investments into the long run, tune off the same noise and focus on the same signals, I think is extremely important.
Collaboration.
Yes.
Very important indeed. Thank you so much, Vincent, Clerc, for all your insights today. Very valuable conversations on how to build more sustainable and robust supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you.